Well, welcome to all of you for joining us here at the Institute on Religion and Democracy, which is also the home of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. I'm Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and delighted to host and to welcome back, after several years' absence, Dr. Timothy Mallard, who is an old friend to IRD and to Providence, and really dates back to almost the founding of Providence a decade ago. And we're honored that he has written for us and spoken for us on several occasions, and we have anxiously awaited publication of his book, Moral and Spiritual Injury and War, Russo-Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and Beyond, by Dr. Timothy Mallard, who will speak to us, I'm guessing, about 20 minutes or so. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards. This is being broadcast live on IRD's social media channel. So if you do speak, be aware that you are going out live, and the video will go on to YouTube as a permanent resource. So Tim, welcome back, and congratulations on this great accomplishment. Should I leave this here with you?
No, that's okay. Well, thank you all so much. And George, I think you've got me good, or excuse me, got me well. Boy, I apologize about that. I want to thank the Institute on Religion and Democracy, IRD here, and Providence Magazine for hosting us tonight for this American book launch. We did what we call a soft launch a couple of weeks ago at the Defense Academy in Shrivenham, United Kingdom, the Royal Defense Academy, and but this is the big stateside launch. So I'm really grateful to IRD, to Mark Tooley, to James Diddams, to Mark Levecki, to the entire team, to Sarah. Thank you so much for all your hard work in making tonight a reality. Thank each and every one of you for coming tonight. Many of you have come from some distance. I think our friend Clay Garner gets the award. Well, no, let's see. He came from North Carolina, but Caroline, our daughter, came up from Texas today. She surprised us walking in the door today and flew in. So I'm really honored tonight to have my wife Sharon, two of our children, Anna and Caroline, and then Caroline's fiance Jack Maniscalco here. And it's always also, by the way, an honor to have former students, and I've got one of the best that ever sat in one of my classes, Lieutenant Colonel Matt Schneider, right here, United States Air Force. So Matt, thanks for coming out as well. You need to know, and I write about this in the book, that I have several lenses, we'll call them, frames of reference that govern how I wrote this book. One is that I am a retired Army chaplain, as many of you know, and I'm the son of a retired, now passed away Army chaplain. My father served for over 30 years in the United States Army as well. So I've lived the experience of serving in the profession of arms up to the strategic level, and just retired last year. I'm also a part academically of the camp of Christian realism, which many people here in IRD are firmly in as well. I make no bones about that. I'm a just war ethicist as well. We were talking with somebody at the beginning prior to the address here tonight and about the just war tradition and how it infuses what I write as well. So that's in the book. And perhaps a bit oddly, I'm a certified Army strategist as well. So I'm, unlike most chaplains, I look at things at a different level. And Mark Levecki and I, Nigel Bigger, others have been looking at this issue of moral injury for many, many years. We've been writing about it. We've been speaking about it. And one of the things that I decided to do was to take all these lenses from which through which I view the world and view the problems in the profession of arms, and to write this book, but at a strategic level. So you'll notice that the subtitle is Russo-Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and Beyond. One of the things that I've been concerned about in terms of moral injury studies particularly is that they have been too focused at what I would say is the tactical level of war. It's not that internal woundedness of individuals is not important. I'm not saying that in the least. But the discussions around moral injury are almost solely focused on that level. How does let's say a clinician treat a patient? What are the issues that patient is dealing with? Let's say that they're a former member of the profession of arms or a retired warrior. But the problem is this issue of moral injury, and as I delineated in the book as well, spiritual injury, have now morphed into really strategic problems for entire people groups, nation states, professions, and have become problems of strategic consideration at the highest levels of war. And I remember when I taught at the Army War College, one of the things that they always tried to tell us was, bad generals fight the last wars. Well, I was never going to be a general, so that's good. But I didn't want to take a look at these issues only through the American lens of what we recently concluded in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I do have a section in the book on Afghanistan, and I'm pretty unsparing in my punches about the changing in policy and strategic policy ends over 4 different presidential administrations and the effect that had on the ground in NATO. As a matter of fact, I was talking with a colleague today, and I said it was those decisions in some sense that set the conditions for moral injury to occur to our individual forces on the ground. But nonetheless, I am examining in the book the current conflicts in both Ukraine and between Israel and Iran. And the contention I make, by the way, is along with many other strategists, that Israel has been in a at times low-grade, at times high-grade war with Iran for some years now, but manifested in several proxy fights around the Middle East, some of which are going on. That is why I make this claim in terms of the central idea of this book. So if you take away one thing, that's it. Moral and spiritual injury are now internal wounds of war that impact not only warriors, but also their families, communities, forces, and nations. That is the main idea. So now, before we get into that, I do have some assumptions, and you deserve to know these, okay? And some of the assumptions are these. Number one, pastoral theology has a voice in the profession of arms. And that is, frankly, I think a disputed claim. I make that as a former Army chaplain, but there are a number of, frankly, moral philosophers who are secular ethicists or clinicians who would absolutely categorically disagree with me in that regard. But I think that pastoral theology has a voice in the profession of arms, and it's time to begin reclaiming that. This book is, in one sense, an attempt to do that. Number two, I think that particularly the field of moral injury, Angela, come on in. I think particularly the field of moral injury has suffered from a therapeutic and a clinical hegemony that has, in one sense, pushed aside the voice of pastoral theology, even within the attempts to deal with moral injury. So that's not necessarily in the profession of arms only, but that's outside. But I think that hegemony has, frankly, created a type of vapor lock that has pushed out other voices that could attend to the suffering of warriors and families. Number three, I think that there is a need for returning understanding to the relationship of moral and spiritual injury to relationships and how those impact future war. Now, this is a bit of a nuance, but when Jonathan Shea first wrote his seminal book, Achilles in Vietnam, there were 2 things that he focused on that I am arguing we need to return to in the profession of arms about moral injury. I also make this extension to spiritual injury. Number one, that this is in one sense a communal or a relational type of injury. Shea never intended for our understanding about moral injury to only be relegated to the individual. He meant to show how it was impacting entire units. In fact, he talked about a military unit with the Greek term themis as a moral entity unto itself. And it's predicated on this inchoate relationship between the leader and the led and those on the right and the left, right? I think we need to return to that relational understanding of these types of injuries and then impact or assess how those will impact or be impacted by future war. Number 4, I think that great power competition and nation-state warfare is the paradigm of war in the near future. I don't think that we're going to have the counterinsurgency fights that we had in either Afghanistan or Iraq in the near-term future. So I think for the American profession of arms particularly, we've got to continue to move aside from that. Number 5, I think that this is probably a major claim for me in the book, that the ontology of the warrior and his or her family must be reclaimed in terms of our understanding of these types of injury. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you take the idea that the utility of a warrior is related to his or her performance to the profession, then by derivation, what you were saying is, or at least your thinking is leading you perhaps into the trap of thinking, that person's utility and worth ends when they take off their uniform and end their service to the profession of arms or the nation state. Now, that, if you think about that, has powerful impacts on the individual. Because what happens to them in an all-consuming profession like we have, the profession of arms, when their service has to end, let's say by retirement or by injury. I met a young man today who just a few years in the profession, but then was catastrophically wounded in Afghanistan. He spent 15 years dealing with his injuries and trying to live still in relation to that sense of woundedness. But even though the physical injuries have healed, he is still struggling. He is still wrestling with this question of identity. Who am I? That is also a question of ontology. It's being, right? My worth to as an individual is not necessarily tied to what I provide to the state. It is inherent in me. As a Christian and as a Christian realist, I say that attains from the imago Dei, the image of God within each and every person. Number 6, I think that, like Shea, moral and ethical development of leaders in the profession of arms is critical to victory in future war. We cannot shortchange that. If we think that we will basically create a technologically superior force and that will automatically yield victory in war, I think we are sadly mistaken. George Marshall, I think, made that assertion in 1941, and he was absolutely correct. It remains paradigmatic today. And I quote Marshall in the book, but I'll let you read that. But then finally, number 7, and this is probably the thing in terms of the just war tradition that sets me apart a little bit. I am arguing that we have to, in the profession of arms, re-understand the telos of war, the purpose of war. The end of war is not necessarily a return to competition. It is the attainment of a just and lasting peace. We have to return to an understanding of peace as being the end of war, not just a return to more competition. So those are some of the assumptions that I make in the book. You deserve to know those ahead of time before you make a decision about whether you want one or not. But, and I'm just going to quickly go through some slides and then take your questions. We'll see if I forgot. I've got a PDF, so I'm going to roll through these slides actually. There. So my wife asked me helpfully one night when we were sitting around the dinner table, she said, think about somebody who's trying to come and just wants to know, why did you write this book? So I thought, okay, why did I write this book? Number 1, I saw these internal wounds, as you see up there, in the warriors and families that I served from over 30 years in the profession of arms. And I wanted to give voice to some of their lingering pain and injuries. Again, however, I began to see the extension of these injuries, not just in the individual, but also, again, in their families, in their communities, their units, in the nation as a whole. I began to see that these were becoming a trend across the profession of arms, and our nation, but frankly, also other nations. It has been amazing to me on this journey how many other nations and their professions of arms, their forces, their military forces are struggling with these issues of moral and spiritual injury. Okay. And I wanted to raise an awareness of that for them. There we go. So what is moral injury? What is spiritual injury? Well, there's an entire chapter on both in the book. Moral injury, there are a number of definitions. Mark has called it moral bruising. I love that term because one of the reasons I like that term because of the injury, a bruise can heal. But there are multiple definitions. I think principally it is centered around either a betrayal, that's Shea's taxonomy, or a transgression, that's Brett Litz and Shira Magan's taxonomy and others. It's a wound principally of the mind. One of the contentions I've made recently, however, is I also think that because of the clinical and the therapeutic hegemony, there's been an over-focus on emotions as being the sole foundation of moral injury in a person. And what I have seen is often warriors dealing with the ethical disequilibrium that comes from trying to think back and assess, what did I do? Should I have done something different? What was done to me? In essence, it's a process of thinking back. Did I do the right thing? Could I have done something different? It may or may not necessarily be attended by maladaptive emotions, or as my colleague Brian Power says, morally damaging emotions. Now, how do I define spiritual injury? I redefine it in the book for the first time in this way. Spiritual injury is a deep wounding of the soul. So here, I am making the case that each and every person who serves in the profession of arms has or is a soul, right? I'm putting down the flag on the fact that in terms of the ontology of the warrior, we cannot get apart from that. We cannot get away from that. It arises from life-altering trauma that misbalances one's core sense of self and threatens then one's relationships to others and to God. So I hope that there's some synchronicity there between the two definitions, but I will rely on you good people for your thoughts on that. One of the things that I say about spiritual injury is it is often characterized by what I see as concentric woundedness. So it's a woundedness that extends out from the individual, first often to the unit in combat, and then to the family system when back home, and then to the community, to the profession, and to the nation. And then there are certain markers that I delineate in there. And by the way, these markers, I don't think we attend to the deep woundedness in the soul of our warriors if we overlook or if we try to bypass these types of markers or expressions of spiritual injury. I have worked with warriors, I've worked with their families who have wrestled mightily with trying to understand the nature of evil and suffering, wrestling with paralyzing doubt, a doubt that can be so consuming that it frankly arrests them in time, and also, frankly, an inability to forgive. These are just a couple of the markers that I have seen. So I won't detail those more here. Why is this a problem for our nation? Well, as I've also said, it's pervasive to the core of a person and persistent over the whole of life. This was one of the things that Shea was dealing with in his therapeutic practice in the 1970s and 80s. Here were men that had left Vietnam years before. Their physical wounds had healed, many of their mental wounds had healed, but they were bearing these other wounds that defied sort of expectation. Again, I consider that they are both individual and communal, and they're applicable not only to the profession of arms, but also other vocations and types of professions and experiences of human life, including violations of business ethics, healthcare, COVID-19. We had a wonderful time at the Naval Academy, I think about 18 months ago or so, with fellow clinicians from New York that have been wrestling with this. The stories of what some of these doctors, nurses had to deal with in terms of violating their own core beliefs in trying to treat people during COVID-19 was heartrending. And then certainly victims of sexual trauma, racism, and domestic violence. How do the wars in Ukraine and Israel illustrate these problems at the strategic level? Well, In the book, I also delineate between the nature of war and the character of war. So broadly, the nature of war are those things that don't change from war to war, and the character of war are those things which may change or be attenuated by conflicts. For instance, one of the things that I consider part of the nature of war is that values, principles, and beliefs are paradigmatic to why we fight. Right? We have to understand what we're willing to die for. And the way I used to put it to my soldiers was, you have to understand what you're willing to live for before you're willing to understand what you're willing to die for. By the same token, once you understand what you're willing to die for, then you'll know what you really want to live for. So those two things are reflexive. But that is true not only at the individual level, but also at the nation state level. By the way, the country where I'm currently in residence in Great Britain is going through this very issue right now. They are really having a discussion societally about what will Britain fight for in the future. They're really wrestling with this. Opportunity cost. Eric and I have talked about this before, Eric Patterson, that our nation, a nation's sons and daughters are our most precious resource, and the injuries of either moral or spiritual injury to them, again, if it lasts long after the battlefield, that's an opportunity cost for the nation. We ought to be considering that in an ad bellum decision to go to war. We ought to be at least trying to assess what will be the post bellum calculus or impact of these types of injuries, not only on the profession of arms, but also on the body politic, the nation itself. Because, even though I'm a civilian now, for years we would say in the military, in the Army, we are your U.S. Army, right? But I think for too long, and at least in America, we have outsourced our security to the profession of arms, and there's been too wide of a gulf between the profession and the very people we serve. Well, these types of injury have an opportunity cost for the nation. And then finally, nation-state war is the paradigm for the next 10 to 20 years. But it's the scale of future war that I'm concerned about. And the risk to both military forces and civilian populations. I think both Russo-Ukraine and Israel-Iran illustrate that these types of injuries, once the battlefield particularly is taken to civilian populations, cannot be confined only to military forces. It extends to the very core of a nation's society. By the way, I'm proud to be doing some work, I hope, with some organizations in Ukraine to help some of their soldiers, but also their civilians begin to recover from this. So finally, what do I hope people will take away? And then we'll get to some questions. A new understanding of moral and spiritual injury, a new understanding and perhaps commitment that we are your profession of arms. We don't work for ourselves. We work for you. And so in our nation, there needs to be a better and a fresh appropriation of what it means to have the type of profession of arms that we do have. This has profound impacts on what we call civil military relations. And then finally, in a pastoral way, a new understanding of how either I or my family might be suffering from these types of injuries. One of the things I will say is most gratifying is to have, and I know I'm writing at the strategic level, but to still have one person come to me and say, now I understand what my father was dealing with for so many years when he wouldn't talk about what he experienced in Vietnam or World War II or this or that conflict, or what now my mother, how she changed when she came back from Iraq or Afghanistan and is walled off even within our own family system. So if this book perhaps gives a type of voice to that person and an understanding, great. Well, I've talked enough. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm willing to entertain any questions you have. And I know we've also got somebody curating the questions online. So do I need to, George, do I need to change or, okay. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take those. And by the way, I'm pretty transparent, so go ahead and ask. And if I don't want to answer it or if it's too sensitive, I'll say that. But yes, sir.
Hello, thank you for the spectacular presentation here. And thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mallard.
Mallard, just like a duck.
Okay. Well, no, I was again asking about your title, not the last name.
Timothy's fine.
Okay. I was curious if you saw or if you are seeing the isolationist swing in the body politic in the wake of the War on Terror and sort of the general shift in particular following, as you mentioned, the shifting sands of exactly what our goals in Iraq and Afghanistan are going to be,
Right.
as being the result of moral and spiritual injuries from war to the body politic? Thank you.
That's a really poignant question, and frankly, I hadn't considered it before. I couldn't say that wholly so or solely so. Did that inform? Perhaps. I'll give you an example. My wife and I live in England right now, but for several years I taught at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And one morning I opened up the Wall Street Journal, and here is a full-page color ad, very professionally done, about moral injury. And I thought, holy cow, didn't expect to see this with my cup of coffee. Sorry, I guess I'm being too flippant. I don't mean. Anyway, the thing that was interesting about the advertisement, again, professionally done, using obviously a professional actor. This man went through a range of emotions in his face, and the nonverbal message was, and it was backed up by the copy in the text. The nonverbal message was, join the profession of arms, go to war, and come back broken. Right. That's what the picture told you. And if in the body politic we take that as, well, if that's going to be the state of my son or my daughter, my most precious resource, why would I want to encourage them to go serve in the profession of arms? So I think for a while it did have impact on recruiting and certainly retention. Recruiting has come back up. I tend to think the isolationist swing would not be solely predicated on that. But the problem is that our nation's joint operational doctrine is predicated on what's a concept called unified action, right? And unified action means that not only do all of our military forces and interagency processes work together to conduct war, so Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force, Coast Guard, all the interagencies, but also all of those of our nation are allies and partner nations, right? And so I think a much more deep impact from the recent wars, and I go into this in the book sometime in some detail, was more emblematic of the decision and the execution of the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. It was simply not done in a way that maintained trust either within the profession of arms or amongst our allies and partner nations. And having had discussions at the strategic level with those allies and partner nations and the people who were there in that country with us, that is a significant gap that we have to attend to. So I tend to think that that's probably not the case as a result of the isolationist shift in American thinking. I don't know. I could be wrong on that. But
I could quickly narrow that down. My question was more, do you think that the unwillingness to stand for American values abroad that the isolationist swing in politics seems to show much of the country now is itself a moral injury the body politic took?
I wouldn't say so. I would say that it frankly is, I talked about the sort of growing divide between the profession of arms and the body politic. I think that one of the things that we have to do as a nation, not only individuals, not only families, but as a nation, we have to have this discussion. And this is the way I close the book. Why are we willing to go to war? Over what are we willing to fight and potentially die? Right? And that's a discussion that I think, Americans just by and large, by the nature of their busy lives and things like that, we may not necessarily want to have. But I think it's time to have that. So that would be my contention. So yeah, you're welcome. Ann, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you use the mic there?
Oh, this mic on the last screen. Sure. Susie. Thank you very much. I was looking forward to this and was well rewarded by everything you said. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, we seem to have talked about building up from the foundational level of the individual to families to groups, etc.
Right.
I was kind of coming to the talk this evening and thinking from sort of the top down, the societal level down. And the reason was in the Ukraine, for example, the Ukraine Russian, when you listen to the propagandists on, from Russian propaganda or whatever, they're talking about things that occurred generations ago. And it seems to have become part of their identity, driving, their aggression, etc. Does your book talk at all about that sort of inherited tradition of, moral disequilibrium if we don't continue this narrative from the past?
Thank you for the question.
Yes.
And the answer is no, I don't. But I take your point, and I do want to delineate. When I'm talking about the effects of these types of injuries on individuals, families, communities, professions, nation states, a clarification, I'm glad your question raised this for me. I am thinking of those in the democratic polities of particularly the West, right? So the calculus for going to war in an autocracy like Russia is completely different and can't be really drawn in terms of parallel why Russia and particularly President Putin decided to, by the way, not only invade Ukraine in 2022, but Crimea in 2014, Georgia 2008, right? So Russia has been very stealthily but very effectively employing what's so-called Gerasimov doctrine for many, many years now in a lot of ways, both in these countries and in others. So their calculus about why they go to war is much different. Now, to your point, however, one of the things that President Putin is very effective at doing is the strategic communication, the building of a narrative that is tied to a historical myth around the Kievan Rus, right? So the idea that Russia is in fact the legitimate heir of the Rus identity, going back to Kiev in 988 and the baptism of Volodymyr in the Dnieper River. The Ukrainians say no, that is part of our heritage is Ukraine. So there is this battle of narrative there, and I think that part of why President Putin uses that so effectively is in fact not for external communication to the other nation states of the world, it's for internal communication to the people inside Russia. But their calculus for doing that, using that as a strategy, and going to war are completely different than why we would go to war in the West. So, yeah, maybe the West is a passe term, but anyway, others. Yes. Yep. Oh, I think we need to pass the microphone if that's possible. Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks. I apologize. I didn't know that you were going to ask a question. So we'll get to you next. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. My question is this. Do you think that the long deployments of our troops and our National Guard to places like Iraq and Afghanistan and the need for the people here in the homeland to carry on and to take up their responsibilities, do you think that's changed us in any way? Because I feel like, that's like sort of written into the Constitution that everyone in the United States has a role to play, has, something to give.
Right.
And I feel like for a long time, we've just sort of said that, but not really meant it. Do you think that that's changing now that, we're seeing that we've had these long engagements?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's changing. I think it's embedded. And why I say that is 1973, in America, we made the move to the all-volunteer force after Vietnam. And the all-volunteer force, by all accounts, has been fairly successful. I think it's been very successful. But what it is, one of the effects of that is it has created a professional warrior class that the nation has then, I think, outsourced its national security to, so that we have people who have, 5, 9, 12. I have one friend, 13 deployments, right, in a 25-year career. And so you would deploy, you would go serve, you'd come back, you'd retrain up, you'd go to another unit, you'd redeploy again, right? and the problem with these types of injuries, like moral and spiritual injury, is in one sense they're iterative, but they're also cumulative, right? So as I make the point in the book, the soldier leaves the battlefield, but the battlefield never leaves them. And it might have been on deployment number 3 that a particularly traumatic event occurred, and that soldier can't stop thinking about that, right? Or then they try to take care of it with the narcotic of more work and more deployments, or even. And by the way, I know friends of mine who have said, "Yeah, I just got to the point where I couldn't take being back here, so I just redeployed again." Right? So unfortunately, I don't think these wars have changed that model. I think the profession has learned a lot, and again, my concern about future wars is scope and scale, because if we have a major theater or global war, nation-state competitors, perhaps the United States, perhaps the People's Republic of China, it will simply dwarf the conflicts that we had in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so the prevalence of these injuries will just mushroom out from there. So in that sense, I'm deeply concerned about the utility of the profession of arms to maintain its efficacy on behalf of the nation in that type of particular conflict. I'm deeply concerned about that. But thank you. And yes, you had a question. Thank you.
Could you talk more about the phrase clinical hegemony that you referenced in your presentation?
Sure. I know that's probably a loaded term. I say that with great respect, however, and affection for psychologists, psychiatrists, licensed clinical social workers, others who have dedicated their lives to working with warriors. When I use that phrase, I am not necessarily castigating those individuals. I, in fact, have been the beneficiary of many of, as I put it in the book, the healing arts of those people. They carried themselves into me in a very real way. What I'm referring to there is the hegemony of the clinical and the therapeutic professions to push aside other voices for consideration in how these injuries both impact individuals and then how they impact entire professions. Now, there are changes and welcome changes. Our colleague Warren Kinghorn down at Duke University has alerted us and well, not alerted us, really been in the vanguard of a much more interdisciplinary treatment approach to moral injury in individual patients in the Veterans Administration, including beginning to work chaplains into the treatment teams. But my concern is, again, that's at a tactical level, that's an individual level. At the strategic level, I think those professions have very much worked to shut out the voices of as I put it, pastoral theology, to even talk about issues like the ontology of the warrior and what the effects of that might have on moral injury or spiritual injury in that person and or their family. So it's not necessarily a non-appreciation for the individual treatment modalities that these professions bring or the dedication of many of those people. Absolutely not. It's more a categorization of the effects of their professions, and I think, frankly, pushing out some other voices that need to be heard at the strategic level across the nation state and the profession. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks. Eric.
Eric Patterson, Victims of Communism Foundation. The question is something different today than in past generations of warriors? You seem to suggest that maybe due to having an all volunteer force, that where people serve for much longer periods of time, perhaps, that maybe something's different than the warriors of 1945 or the warriors of 1918. And would you tell us more about that?
I will say that generally, I don't think there's that much difference except in one particular area. And that is in the lack of moral formation and the lack of ethical self-understanding in today's American profession of arms. We began to have this challenge in the United States Army about over 20 years ago. So as an example, to answer your question, the United States Army considers itself a values-based profession, right? And every soldier who serves more than several years knows loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Those are the 7 Army values. Now, personal courage might be an act more than a value, I grant, but that's the way the Army frames it, right? Okay, great. And in good Army fashion, they form the acrostic of leadership, right? The Army likes simple things like that. The problem was when we began to take in young soldiers, beginning in about 2003-4 in that time frame, and we wanted to, in basic training at their first training station, before they even went to learn their specialization, when we wanted to instill in them these values, and the fact that these values should be paradigmatic for their service to the nation, one of the things that drill sergeants, company commanders began to run into was that these young soldiers didn't know what a value was. They had no understanding of what values were, what morals were, what ethics were, how those things related to the self, why they should even be, concerned with those things. And so we had to go through an entire program of ethics instruction from basic training on up, just to begin to teach them about the utility and the criticality of being a values-based profession. Now, I think one of the things that has occurred as a result of that is we have been so effective at that one of the problems that we have now is when we do have those warriors that serve 20, 25 years, 30 years, that's the majority of their working life. They're not going to go back to the American body politic and serve 30 more years in a different vocation or task. That profession has become so consuming. It's defined their what they wear, where they're assigned, what they believe, everything that now they have problems breaking away from that profession and separating their individual identity from their professional identity. And so one of the common questions I get from career soldiers that retire is, who am I? Right? They know they're about to take off the uniform, but they don't have any kind of real understanding about who as an individual they are. Right? And so I do think that in that case, we've been very successful. But other than that, I'm not making a differentiation that there's a qualitative difference between today's American warriors and those of 1945. What I am making a absolute judgment on is the way that we employ those soldiers in repetitive deployments over and over and over again. That is having a deleterious effect on them, their families, their communities, and their profession, and the nation, I think, as a whole. So, yeah. And somebody give me the high sign when we got to cut off. I'll keep going, but.
Hi, Dr. Mallard.
Yep.
I have a question, and it relates mostly to an aspect of history. You'll have to forgive the historian in me, but I see you mentioned the transition between essentially you mentioned mandatory military service ending in Vietnam and the transition to a professional military, and somewhat of a disconnect between the body politic and the soldier class, the warrior class itself.
Right.
I see similarities between that and the Marian reforms in Rome. I'm just curious what you would think generally, and you can feel free not to answer this if you feel it to be too controversial, but what are your opinions on mandatory military service versus voluntary military service? And would you think that collectively as a nation, we would be better off if every single person operated on the South Korean model where, you do 2 years of mandatory military service early on in life and it gives you experiences, but you don't have to continue military service after that? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question I think we need to have within our nation. Now, to your point, I think that the efficacy or the effectiveness of the contemporary profession of arms is leaps and bounds ahead of the conscript force that governed America from really 1917 all the way through 1973. That said, what I would advocate for is a broader understanding of what it takes to attain collective security within the nation. What I mean by that is, many people may not know that in the nation of Finland, right, there are very few people who serve in the active armed forces. There are some, and they serve, but there are a vast percentage who serve in the reserves, and they do their mandatory military training, and then they get their posting and they go serve in the reserves, but they go back to civilian life. And across Finland, there is a whole of nation understanding of what it attains, what it needs to attain collective security. Now, understanding Finland's sense of threat is much more acute than perhaps ours because they share part of a land border with Russia. So they've watched this fight in Ukraine very, very closely. But the Finnish people as a whole, even if they don't have even a reserve role in the military forces, they have a civil defense role. They have some sort of role in the security of the nation state if war were to break out. And they practice that annually. And they're trained on that. And Finnish citizens simply take that as, well, this is what it means to be a good Finn, a good citizen. I frankly don't see that as a bad model for what we could ask our own people to do. It's not so much that we need to go either the conscript force or the all volunteer force. I do think we need to rethink how we employ the all volunteer force and how we define the concept of national security and collective security within the body politic in America. So I think
we have time for maybe one more question, but people should know that we have a box of your books here.
Oh, okay.
If anyone would like to get a copy.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mark. We do have a box. So anyway, we'll talk about that afterwards. But Scott.
Chaplain Mallard, it's always a privilege to be in your presence. I always feel like I'm a student. So thank you very much for this incredibly wise and insightful presentation. Help me draw a nexus between young men and women who have a well-formed conscience. And it seems to me that those who have the most well-formed conscience are the most potentially damaged by moral and spiritual injury. And then the nexus is leadership and the cause of moral injury. So how do we immunize our young men and women before they join the military? And then how do we inoculate senior leadership to prevent moral injury in our young men and women?
Okay, thanks, Scott. That's a great question. So two things I would say. Number one, there is a longitudinal study working through the VA right now that's looking at the effects of moral injury over time relative to the issue of moral formation. Right, and one of the early results that seems to be indicative is something that I certainly saw in my time, but my experience is not paradigmatic, and that is that actually those who have a well-formed moral conscience and sense of ethics and the ability to employ that in action, I seem to recover faster from moral injury. Not to be more susceptible to it, and frankly, more susceptible to lingering and permanent effects. Right, they seem to recover faster from that. So I would say that, in fact, one of the arguments I make in the book is ethical formation helps prevent these types of injuries in the long term for the nation state. Now, you asked about leadership, and I'll close on this. And this is one of the things that I think this really goes back to Jonathan Shea. Shea was trying to alert, in one sense, the profession of arms to the criticality of leadership. And as an example, many of you may have heard of the atrocity by the AmeriCal Division, Lieutenant William Calley in My Lai, 1968, South Vietnam, over 500 Vietnamese civilians killed. The United States Army asked itself in 1970 the question in the wake of My Lai, all right, was this an isolated incident, or do we have a broader problem in the profession? And so they did a qualitative study across the entire United States Army officer corps. And what the Army found was we had a problem in terms of leader development. And this was one of the reasons that we began to focus so much in terms of moral and ethical instruction and leader development, not only at the war colleges, but going all the way back to the service academies. So the entirety of one's career, or in ROTC. So the point being, and this goes to, I think, again, ties into Shea. Shea was trying, I think, to sound the tocsin, and it's the same one that I want to sound. Leaders have to understand that subordinates rely on them in one sense. They may be morally well-formed, and they may have a sense of clear conscience, but they look to those leaders to be and do the right thing in the crucible of conflict. And when that leader fails, that can produce a derivative crisis in that junior warrior or in their family. I think this is one of the problems that we saw in Carlisle in 2021 in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was a crisis of trust, right? So when leaders fail morally and ethically, it creates the conditions for a crisis of trust. Inside the formation, as my colleague Don Snyder has talked about, but also outside the formation. If we get leaders, I think, to understand one thing, it is that has got to be first and foremost in their minds in the exercise of their duties. But thank you all very much. You've been very patient, and I'll be around for a while if you want to talk individually. Again, I want to thank Mark Tooley, Mark Levesque, James Diddams, and the whole team here at IRD and Providence. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you all for coming out. And again, I hope you're instructed by the book. Thanks so much. God bless.